Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Adventures of Beardman. Today we're going to be taking a look at a concept builder on physicsclassroom.com titled Color Addition and Subtraction, under the topic of light and color. Before we get started, there's a link up here to a video that I made in the past that goes into more depth about how our eyes see color. But I'm going to highlight that here enough to get through this concept builder. So our eye has 4 different kinds of receptors in the back of it. Rods, which are very sensitive to light and therefore really help us when it's dark, but there's only one kind of them. That's why when it's really dark, everything looks kind of black and white. You either see light or you don't, black and white. But when we have more light, then it triggers our cones. We have 3 kinds of cones: blue cones, green cones, and red cones. Each of those is more sensitive to different wavelengths of light. We're going to simplify this graph into a picture that looks something more like this. We have blue cones, green cones, and red cones kind of next to each other here. And if we have blue light come in, it will trigger the blue cone. Blue light would not trigger either of these cones. And therefore that sends signals to our brain: I'm not being triggered, I'm not being triggered, I am being triggered. And our brain says that is blue. If we have green light come in, the green one's triggered, the blue and red ones are not triggered, and our brain says, I see green. And if we have red light come in, it triggers the red cone, but it does not trigger the blue or the green, and it screams to ourselves, I see red. Now, keep in mind, you saw in that first one, there's all these overlaps. It's a little bit more complex than this. I have simplified it for the initial learning of how our eyes see colors. So now, what happens with all the other colors on this spectrum? Well, we don't have a yellow or a cyan receptor, a cone. And so here's what happens. When the yellow hits, it triggers the red and the green cones. So the red and the green cones scream, I've been triggered. And the blue one says, I haven't been triggered. And our brain says, red and green. That means I'm seeing yellow. Because you can see yellow is partway between the red and the green. There is a second way we can trigger this. Notice if both of these cones are being triggered, then we see yellow. So if we had green and red light enter our eye, then the green and the red would get triggered. And our brain can't differentiate that from the yellow hitting. And so our brain screams, I see yellow. So you see there were 2 ways to get yellow. Either from yellow light, a certain wavelength, or from the wavelengths of red and green, which trigger the same things. I see yellow. Same thing if we get cyan, then that triggers the green and the blue, and we see cyan, or we could get blue and green, and that would still trigger the same 2 cones, and therefore we would see cyan. Now you'll notice that there is no single piece of light that can trigger blue and red. The red and the blue don't overlap without the green being triggered. And so therefore, the color that we get if we send red and blue light has to be something that's not on the spectrum here, the electromagnetic spectrum. Instead, we see a color called magenta, which is not on the spectrum. It is another color. There's no single wavelength that is magenta. But if we get red and blue cones triggered and they scream to our brain, I've been triggered, and the green one says, I haven't been triggered, then we see magenta. Now, if all 3 cones get triggered, we see white light. Often we're getting all of the wavelengths, and that's when we see white light. And if none of them are triggered, we see black light. I want to mention really quickly, TVs and monitors like the one you're looking at right now, all they have in them is a little thing that gives out blue, a little thing that gives out green, and a little thing that gives out red. And by how much of each of those the monitor sends, you can see any of these colors and other ones like magenta that aren't ever a single wavelength. Pretty cool, huh? Anyways, back to our concept builders. We see in the Apprentice level here, a room is darkened when 2 colored spotlights, one green, one red, shine on the white screen. What color will the screen appear at the location where the 2 spotlights overlap? So this is just saying pretty much exactly what we just did. If we put green towards our eye and red towards our eye, that means we trigger the green and the red. The green and the red cones are triggering. They fire at us. And if green and red trigger, I see yellow. So your answer to this would be yellow would be in this spot. So look back through the rest of the video, figure out what colors make what, and you'll get that idea. Keep in mind, this is different than what you may have been taught for 10 years in art class, because these are light. So this is something called an additive process. When you mix paints, you're getting a subtractive process. We'll talk about that in a future video. Before we get to the master and wizard level, we have to talk about what happens when light strikes a surface. Well, kind of one of three things will happen. Sometimes more than one will happen. First of all, the photon might absorb. That means that the energy from that photon is used to do something else, like heat up the surface or remove an electron if we have enough energy to be ionizing. If a material absorbs red, that means red photons will disappear and their energy will turn into heat, heating it up. A lot like asphalt warms up on a sunny day. It absorbs the light from the sun and turns it into heat. A photon hitting a material could reflect. The energy from that photon is still in that photon, but is now headed somewhere else. This is like when you look in a mirror. The light leaves your skin, it bounces off, it reflects off the mirror, and it comes back to your eye so you can see it. It is not absorbed by the mirror. Now, this also happens with some colors of light on many materials. Some materials may reflect blue light because they don't have a way to absorb it. And when they reflect blue light, we'll see what happens in just a moment. The last thing that's not going to happen in this concept builder, but I want to mention it, is it could refract. And refracting means the photon will continue traveling in the new medium. Like when a photon leaves your straw that's in a glass of water, and it travels through the water, and then it goes into a new substance like the glass or the air, it's going to bend, and that's called refracting. Just so it's clear, different surfaces will absorb different wavelengths of light. Some will absorb red, some will absorb green, etc. We'll see that coming up here in the master level. So in the master level, again, we have a room that's darkened, meaning the only light is coming from these flashlights. 3 colored spotlights, excuse me, these are spotlights. 1 red, 1 green, and 1 blue shine on a piece of paper. It's not always going to be all 3. A person viewing the paper observes the color to be green. We can see that here. The person is observing it and thinking, oh, I see green, based on which cones are being triggered. Well, we know that you only see green when only green gets to you, so that means green is reflected. Since we know red doesn't get to the person's eyes, must be absorbed by the material, and blue, since we know it doesn't get to the person's eyes, must also be absorbed. So since this question is asking what colors of light are being absorbed by the paper, well, red and blue must have been absorbed if green was the only thing making it to this person's eye. So that's what you'll do. You think about what colors they're seeing. You'll think about which cones must have been triggered in order to make this color. And anything else that was present here must have been absorbed because it didn't reflect back to the eye. And you see green got there. Both of these must not have been triggered, and therefore they were absorbed. Next one, we see in the wizard level, very similar things going on, except for we get a lot more detail that we're going to put in here. So first thing, what is going to be incident here is all the colors that are leaving the spotlights. So every color you see leaving the spotlight, mark that it is incident. Then we have to think about what's happening with these. Well, cyan, what does cyan mean? Cyan means that the blue and green cones are being triggered. Blue and green. So that means the blue light must be reflected and the green light must also be reflected, since those are the 2 colors that make cyan. It also tells us that the red light cannot be reflected since it was not seen by the person. Therefore, the red light was absorbed. So you would circle the red light as being absorbed and the blue and the green light as being reflected because they bounced back so the person saw cyan. All right, I hope that helps you to understand how we see light, how it's emitted, incident, absorbed, and reflected, and how our brains interpret it. Hope to see you the next time on the Scientific Adventures of Beardman. If you enjoyed the video, click that like and subscribe button. Keep exploring, keep investigating, and keep those beards bushy.